You are listening to the SDSU podcast presented by the East Village Times with your hosts Andre Hagverdian and Paul Garrison. Welcome, listeners, back to the SDSU podcast. I'm your host, Andre Hagverdian. We'll be joined shortly by my co-host, Paul Garrison. This is episode 79, and we are back talking about conference realignment. Yep, the topic that will not get resolved, or at least not yet as we sit here in early to mid-July. San Diego State's deadline of June 30th came and went with no resolution on a Pac-12 media rights deal, a Pac-12 offer, an acceptance, and a departure from the Mountain West. We have Lettergate saga that's become public. Instead of Paul and I just talking about our thoughts as we have in previous episodes, we wanted to get some insight from someone that's been in this business, in the media rights business for a long time. Bob Thompson, who is a retired president of Fox Sports Networks, a co-founder of the Big Ten Network, currently is principal of Thompson Sports Group, which is a consulting company that he started after his retirement from those networks. And so we wanted to get his take on what he believes is happening with the San Diego State Mountain West saga, the Pac-12 media rights deal, where San Diego State fits in from a marketability standpoint. He's someone that has been vocal on Twitter, at least with his tweets about what he thinks is happening, and maybe potentially the public leak of those letters harming or San Diego State, or making it look like they are not doing this, the right way or per se. And so it was a good opportunity for us to get his thoughts on it in an interview format. Hope you guys will enjoy it, and Paul and I will be back afterwards for some quick takeaways. Let's get to the interview. We want to welcome Bob Thompson, retired president of Fox Sports Networks and co-founder of the Big Ten Network, to the SDSU podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Andre. Paul, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
We appreciate you taking the time. Obviously we want to get into San Diego State conference realignment, the Pac-12 media rights deal. But I also see that you're principal of the Thompson Sports Group. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. When I retired back in 2009, I figured I could play golf every day. So I formed a consulting agency that basically I take on various clients that in subjects that might interest me, mostly sports or television, and have had 15, 20 clients over the years. And I work just enough to let some dollars coming in and not to interrupt my golf game.
Nice. For those that may not be familiar with you, how have you been involved in sports media rights deals in the past?
Well, I started my career in the cable television side of things and worked for a cable operator for about 8 or 9 years, and worked with a variety of sports networks over the years, regional sports networks, obviously the national guys like ESPN, folks like that. And then ultimately I moved to the programming side of the business in 1989, ran a regional sports network in Denver, launched a number of others around the country, and that was for an entity called Liberty Sports. Liberty was subsequently bought out by Fox, and I stayed with Fox, and it's basically the individual responsible for the U.S. and international sports networks, and spent most of my time negotiating rights deals over the years. So whether it be local pro teams, collegiate conferences, DJ golf for international rights, things like that. I spent most of my time on that. And the last 9 years were as president of Fox Sports Networks and Fox Sports International.
It makes sense then that over the weekend, your tweets, they generated some buzz here locally. The newspaper used your tweets in a pair of articles, one of them an editorial, and it was their proof that SDSU had, and this is the title of the article, had fumbled the ball in, sending all the letters back and forth with the Mountain West and the whole negotiation of this part. Could you just explain, your perspective on what's happening?
Sure. I've been involved in a lot of conference realignment over the years. Usually, conference realignment, we're seeing it now, happens in conjunction with the expiration of television rights deals. And so obviously the networks want to know who's going to be in the conference going forward. They want to know, who might be coming in. Certainly you find out usually who's leaving ahead of time. And so you're trying to figure out, what kind of replacement is going to happen here. So I've certainly dealt with a number of them, Pac-12 teams coming and going, well, mostly coming in the Pac-12 situation, potential other schools that were going to come to the Pac-12 a number of times. The the transformation of the Big 12 over the years, losing Colorado, losing Missouri, losing Arkansas, things like that. So certainly, in my involvement with the Big 10 over the years through not only rights deals, but also managing or overseeing the conference, the Big 10 network, the channel, I certainly had a lot of involvement with schools coming and going. So I'm pretty familiar with how all this stuff works.
Absolutely. And so, before those articles came out, I reached out to you about the same tweets and, and shared with you an article that I had written that basically said that with all the consultants, with all the lawyers, they couldn't have made this obvious of a mistake. That's kind of been my premise in that it seems like, at least from your tweets, that you've landed that the mistakes were made. Why is it that you've landed there?
Well, because normally this type of stuff is done behind closed doors, not in the press. It just doesn't happen that way. And so, something, unless I'm missing something, which I said yesterday, something's gone amiss. And whether, I read an article that suggested that maybe somebody, instead of just keeping it within the presidential group, somehow an AD got a hold of it and maybe there was a leak. It just makes no sense for either party, whether it's the Mountain West Conference or San Diego State, to have this kind of public negotiation going on. It's just usually not how things are done. When there is movement, and when there's movement that is related to a what do you call them? A fee associated with a departure, as San Diego State was looking at, is it 17? Is it 34? Those things are highly negotiated and done very quietly. That's the Texas-Oklahoma resolution not too long ago.
Right.
The number that was floating around was they're going to have to pay $100 million. And I can guarantee you they didn't pay $100 million, but everybody's happy. The TV guys are happy. The SEC gets a couple of years earlier. The Big 12 doesn't have to go through a multi-year divorce process. And, it worked out for everybody. But that was all done behind closed doors. That was not done, in your publication or the Athletic or, Sports Business Journal. It's just, there's too much at stake here. The last thing you want to do is end up in a legal situation, which universities, conferences, chancellors, university presidents, they don't like that at all. And so, you try and get these things resolved, quietly and behind closed doors, as opposed to a giant, demonstration of ineptitude. And I'm not saying that's what happened here. I'm just saying that certainly something happened, because this is so outside the norm of a typical, departure move at a conference.
Outside of this public impasse between San Diego State and the Mountain West and the letters and all of that, has anything of substance taken place? Meaning, is this how big of a mess is this, or is it something that can be cleaned up if the parties actually chose to clean it up by the end of the month?
I think it can be cleaned up. I mean, there's a variety of ways. I mean, certainly something's negotiated. Certainly a simple way would be if the Pac-12 got a TV deal and actually invited San Diego State, and then boom, it's fixed.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Although I'm sure some people at the conference, might have a different impression of that. So, I think it can certainly be resolved. There's nothing that's unresolvable if you've got motivated parties on each side. And so, it's at the end of the day, it's a negotiation. Everybody's probably not going to be 100% happy, and that probably means it was a good deal.
If these letters had taken place but had been kept, private, do you think that with the June 30th deadline that San Diego State or the Mountain West would have had to say something publicly, or would they have just let that date pass and kept everything private?
I don't believe they would have had to say something publicly. I mean, until San Diego State says they're leaving, there's really no reason for it to go public. And I kind of read all the letters and don't know all the back and forth going on. But I think certainly there was plenty of opportunity for, even if January 30 didn't happen, that there could still have been a deal put together that everybody was happy. I mean, exit fees are there for a reason, but they're also highly negotiable and can be overcome regardless of what it says in writing or in the bylaws of the conference. So I don't look at that as any of these dates as a huge issue. Certainly, if you play it right down the middle per the terms of the bylaws or the grant of rights, whatever the governing agreement is for the TV rights in the Mountain West Conference, then it's pretty simple. But even if you don't, or all the circumstances don't fall exactly into place the way you'd wish, it's still possible to move on.
I think when I reached out to you, I said confirmation bias is like the worst thing. So I definitely love you coming on and sharing, a different opinion than I have, because for me, I just, like you said, publicly ineptitude, I have a hard time believing they would do that on purpose 3 times. You know what I mean? Like it's hard for me to think that with the consultants, et cetera. But, while we have you on, I'd love to just pick your brain a little bit about, various parts of all of this that you have expertise on that we don't. One of the things that we hear a lot is that, the Pac-12, they have bigger media markets, but then other people, they say, well, the Big 12, they have more passionate fan base, more people show up to their games, et cetera. In these kind of deals, what plays a bigger role?
Well, I wish it was an exact science that I could say we say 33% on this and 48% on that. And, it's not. I mean, certainly as a TV guy, numbers always matter to me and market size matters to me because, at the end of the day, how the TV guys make their money is either through subscription fees that they charge distributors, cable operators, direct TV, folks like that, and through advertising. And that's all numbers driven. And the bulk of those numbers come from subscription fees as opposed to advertising revenue. Certainly I'm going to look at numbers, but I'm also going to look at things like passionate fans, as you mentioned, rivalries, history, all those type of things. And I mean, the perfect example is you can't look at the SEC and the SEC markets where they're actually located and say, oh my God, it's all about the numbers. It's not. I mean, it's about the SEC and the fact that it's so broad. You look at the Big Ten and it's got big markets and passionate fans and huge numbers of, former alumni. And so, you've got that. Then you've got the Big 12, which has, extremely passionate fans. And they've got some good markets. They're just not as widely spread as, say, the Big Ten. And then you kind of, I looked at the guys on the coast, the ACC and the Pac-12, and, they're kind of somewhere in between or, a bit below all those. They've got some good markets, but it's not as passionate. West Coast certainly has their time zone challenged in that the times of days that they can play don't always comport with what the TV folks have available. And on the ACC, they kind of suffer from being, are they a basketball conference with a couple of football schools, or are they a football conference that does basketball pretty good most of the time? So, it kind of goes back and forth. But you kind of look at the body of work over a prolonged period of time to get an idea of how each conference kind of measures, on the scale. And it those that check off all the boxes, and that's, size, passion, and history, rivalries, those type of things, you're going to certainly end up probably with more dollars than those that don't check quite as many boxes.
And then turning, to San Diego State. I mean, what is their, how do they check? What boxes do they check at what you just mentioned? And does the departure of, UCLA, USC from Southern California market that was such a big deal for the Pac-12, does that make them potentially more valuable to that conference?
Well, yeah, San Diego State is certainly from the Pac-12 perspective is sitting in a very good situation. I mean, the conference does not want to give up Southern California, and especially right now when California, Cal and Stanford aren't exactly, blowing the doors down football wise or basketball wise. So, you need to maintain that presence in California and Southern California. And, I've spent years and years in LA, and it's sure there's the LA market and then San Diego market. But to me, from Santa Barbara all the way to, San Diego is just one giant city. I mean, yeah, there's some different TV stations in San Diego and Santa Barbara than from what's in LA. But to me, it's the Southern California market. And I think that from San Diego State standpoint, the fact that the conference wants to maintain a foothold in Southern California and be able to, heavily recruit Southern California and have, for their other schools to be able to recruit down there and say, look, you're going to get to go home and play, in Southern California as well. I think that's very important for the conference and plays right into San Diego State's strength. Then you combine that with, they've had a good football run. They've beaten a lot of Pac-12 teams. Certainly, to tell you about the basketball, I mean that was a great run last year, and they've had a number of great runs for quite a few years. And so I think they kind of hit all the points, and I really look at them a bit like how when Utah came into the Pac-12 conference. A lot of people are like, oh, well, it's just an add-in to make a travel partner for Colorado. Well, the fact of the matter is they were, playing Pac-12 teams while they were in the Mountain West. They were expanding their facilities and they were investing in the football program. And you see what's happened. And, you could make a case that of all the schools that have moved from a, say, lesser conference, or you call it a G5 conference, to a Power 5 conference over the years, and I don't care what conference you're going to, that Utah has had more success as a new conference arrival than really any other school out there that you look at.
There's a lot about what you read about the Pac-12 is, the 10 remaining teams stick together. They don't expand. They get a media deal done and split it 10 ways instead of 11, 12, 14 or whatever. Can the Pac-12 make a media partner happy with just 10 teams? Especially if there's, they want to play midweek games and things like that.
They could. I think the partners are going to want as much inventory as they can, especially if you're looking at a streaming service that's probably going to have a, pretty significant portion of these games. They're going to look for as much bulk or as much inventory as they can get. Plus, I think they want the basketball. I mean, sure, you're going to get some football games, but where you really start picking up bulk is if you add two teams on the basketball side where they're playing 40 games a year or whatever, 30 conference games. So I think it's important, maybe the schools coming in aren't paid out at a full share right off the bat, which isn't unusual. The teams coming into the Big 12, they're those four guys aren't getting as much money, but I guarantee they're getting more than they got where they were at before. So they're probably pretty happy, and they're on the path to a full share. And so I think that if San Diego State, and if there's another, if the word is SMU, I have no inside knowledge of that one way or another. I think that they would both probably be fine coming in at maybe a lesser amount that, for the first couple of years, and then they kind of get invested and start getting a full share.
Yeah, you mentioned streaming. Obviously, that's become very prevalent in some pro sports leagues in the last couple of years with Amazon and Apple TV. From some of the networks that you used to work at, how are they combating that streaming option? Are they working with them, or are they trying to compete with them? how would they look to go about that combination?
Well, it's interesting. They've all kind of taken a different approach. Fox doesn't really have a streaming service. I mean, they have an app that they stream games on, but it's not a separate charge type thing. Then
Yeah.
you've got NBC with Peacock, you've got CBS with Paramount Plus, you've got ESPN/ABC with ESPN Plus, and Disney Plus and all that other stuff. So, they each kind of have their own way to work. Fox has worked with Apple TV Plus on the MLS games. They're the kind of the linear partner for some stuff that doesn't. Well, I guess it all airs as part of the MLS package, but
Yeah.
there's a game or so a week that also gets out on Fox, is simulcast on Fox, so that they get some broader distribution. So I think everybody has a slightly different approach. CBS, Paramount is basically reairs or airs simultaneously CBS product. Peacock has some exclusive product that's not available on NBC. ESPN Plus at this point is an entirely different service than ESPN, the linear network. At some point, there'll probably be an ESPN linear network streaming feed. That doesn't confuse everybody. Probably when they get down around, I'm thinking 50 million homes. The broadcast networks are a little reticent to that the bundle business that they've lived in for so long. At one point, yes, it was up around 100 and something million subscribers, and now we're down to 65 million subscribers. So they've lost roughly 40% of the business. But it's still, that 60% makes a lot of money for those distributors. So I think they're loath to damage that bundle and upset that cash cow any quicker than they absolutely have to, because it's their lifeblood. And I think they've each taken a different approach, and they've each at first it was get as many subs as you can. Who cares about the price, or who cares about how much money you're losing? Well, now they've kind of evolved to, well, we really have to think about how much money are we blowing here trying to get these streaming services off the ground, which is typical. You get some insanity comes into the marketplace, which is not unusual after the launch of a new product or new technology. The next phase is usually some form of consolidation. And so with all these streaming services out there, is there some, is there a deal to be done that kind of, makes them all a whole lot more viable than they are right now?
Seems like every couple of months, someone makes a prediction that the Bill of Media Rights is about to finish up. I think it started with Dan Patrick back in November. It gives the feeling that this is dragging on, that it's, et cetera. What is like a typical media rights kind of calendar? And is the Pac-12 actually, with all of your experience, are they actually really far behind, or, being within a year, is this more typical?
Well, they can take varying amounts of time. I mean, first of all, just being within a year, it doesn't really bother me that much. What bothers me, if anything, is they announced that they were starting like a year ago,
Right.
when they were 2 years out. And so, they clearly felt that they needed to move and move then. But still, here we are a year out with nothing done. I mean, that in and of itself doesn't concern me. That if they just announced today, we're going to start negotiating, that would be fine. But there's a couple of things that can alter the kind of the course of events. Use the Big 12 as an example. They just basically did a renewal with their existing partners, Fox and ESPN. There's some inventory change. Fox picked up some football or basketball, men's basketball that they had never had before. They primarily aired Big 12 football only. So they picked up some additional games. I would assume, I don't know, maybe they were assuming they weren't going to have any Pac-12 basketball going forward, which they'd had for a number of years. So maybe that is a replacement. But for the most part, it's the same partners. And other than some minor changes, it's the same kind of event load. So with that, all you're doing is an extension agreement. You're not doing a full blown contract. It's probably an amendment to an existing deal the last deal was done like 12 years ago. It's probably an amendment to that existing deal, and you put in the new dollars, the new event loads, any other stuff that might need to be addressed because the last deal is 12 years old, and the business world or the TV world has certainly changed since then. So there's probably some modifications to take advantage of or to cover those type of things that weren't necessarily covered back in 2011. Then you look at, say, the Pac-12, which if you listen to what people are saying, you've got some new players involved in the game. And so new players require basically a new contract. It's not an ESPN Fox deal like the last one the Pac-12 did. So you're starting over from scratch, basically. You've got to, a lot of these things involve, if there's multiple players involved, there's kind of some three-way diplomacy that has to go on. You negotiate one part of the deal. Well, that might affect another part of the deal. So then now you have to go back and readdress that. So it adds a new level of complexity to the deal compared to what the Big 12 just went through. So that creates time issues. And the other part is it could be a player that's doesn't have a lot of, if it's a streaming entity, maybe doesn't have a lot of experience in collegiate sports and some of the idiosyncrasies that are required in collegiate rights deals versus other types of deals. And so it just takes time. There's a number of attorneys involved, usually consultants in the conference and things like that. And then ultimately the presidents or the chancellors have to sign off on it. So it can be time consuming, especially when you're introducing new entities into the mix, shall we say?
If you'll be willing to entertain some predictions, we have a couple of last questions for you. Just, do you think that the Pac-12 will exceed what the Big 12 got in media rights?
I've said all along I thought they'd be in the 300 million on 10 schools. And I've said that's since day one, my first day probably on Twitter.
Right.
I'm sticking to that. Can they get a little more than that? Yes, only if they figure out a way to fully monetize the Pac-12 networks. And maybe that's sell it. Maybe that's flip it into a production entity. Maybe it's to make it streaming only. I mean, there's a lot of different ways they could go with the Pac-12 networks that would probably make it a lot more valuable than it is today. So, what they get if they add teams, I don't know, but I'm still with the 10-team conference, 30 million per school, 300 million total, relatively short deal that, I think a lot of people learned from the last deals that were 11, 12 years. They don't need to go that long. I think with the Big Ten and the SEC coming up in the 2030, 2032 range, people are either going to want to get ahead of them or draft on the backside. So 5-6 year deals would be my guesstimate. So, I don't have any inside knowledge on this stuff. Just, kind of seeing what's been done in other deals recently, it would make sense that it's, that type of a situation.
And then last question, does San Diego State get an invite to the Pac-12, and what year you think will be their first year playing there?
I do believe they get an invite. I don't know. My crystal ball is no better than anybody else's. Trust me. I do believe they'll get an invite. I do believe they'll stay at 12 teams. I do certainly expect San Diego State to be one of those two additional teams. So the date, though, that's a little fuzzy in my mind right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you mentioned earlier, negotiating that exit fee could play a huge part, whether it's going to be 2024, 2025, and beyond. So a lot to be determined there.
Yep.
Well, we definitely appreciate you taking the time. You made us a lot smarter about this media rights negotiation stuff. So we definitely thank you for coming on and imparting your wisdom and your experience in that field. So we definitely appreciate it.
My pleasure, guys. I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Have a good day.
All right, you too.
That was our conversation with Bob Thompson, retired president of Fox Sports Network, co-founder of the Big Ten Network. He's been through these media rights deals with, sports conferences, as he talked about, has a lot of knowledge in that regard. So it was great to meet him, to talk to him and get his thoughts. As he said, he doesn't have inside knowledge pertaining to this particular situation, but he's got the knowledge of, how these things play out. What were your main takeaways?
Well, I mean, I would just echo what you just said. In this whole weird world of people who have been able to kind of gain a little bit of a following because of conference realignment, finding people who seem fair, I think, are hard. And in everything that he's done, I thought that he's been very fair. And getting the opportunity, as you said, to meet him and talk with him and to be able to really see that, I thought that came across even more. We invited him on here primarily, I think, just starting off because he had a different take than what we had been saying about all of this stuff with the Mountain West. And I thought that, he took a very fair approach with it. I thought that on the one hand, he said he thought this could have stayed private. And that's kind of like the big mistake, is that it didn't. But then the flip side of it is, he also said that nothing has really happened. There's nothing that they can't. So I thought he took like a very middle road. I think some of the Chicken Little ideas that it was just this horrible thing that's taken place, and that they've fumbled away something or anything like that. I think that he really kind of dissuaded those ideas. But what jumped out to you from the conversation?
Yeah, I was going to say that as well. It might have on the surface seemed like an opposite viewpoint or an opposite take from what you had made. I think it was ultimately the mess was that it became public, not necessarily what they did. As you just mentioned, it can be corrected if the parties want to correct it. Now, we've also talked about the benefit to San Diego State and maybe the Mountain West to have this impasse play out a little bit longer. Maybe with the Pac-12 deal coming in the next couple weeks. But then you also hear other people talk about how it's probably going to be until September until a deal is done. So I don't know if this impasse can continue through the start of the season without maybe the Mountain West wanting clarity or something like that. There's a lot of open questions still. I think it can be fixed clearly, but the parties may not want to fix this anytime soon. But is there a date where the Mountain West may have wink, wink told San Diego State, there's a date that we need this resolved, whether you're in or out, and we'll wait until that date and hopefully the Pac-12 comes in. But if it doesn't, then we need to get it resolved.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the last letter they said a week from now.
The 17th, right?
The 17th, when everybody is going to be meeting and getting together. And that certainly fits the time frame of, can we have a month extension of the first letter and the original thing. But I agree with you. I don't think that this can go on forever. And I agree with Bob when he says that they hate litigation. And we've kind of went down the road of what litigation would look like, so we don't have to beat that drum again. But again, I think cooler heads will prevail. And at the end of the day, at worst, this will just be something that, you remember when they sent those letters back and forth, and it won't be anything much to make of it. I found Bob's conversation about how you value conferences. I found that fascinating. I found it really, really interesting how, he talked about the ACC and the Pac-12 as very similar in terms of, they don't quite have the same passionate fan bases that you see, but they're in better markets, and how all of that plays out. And so I thought that how he said, it's not a science. And I think that's, ultimately what a lot of this stuff comes down to is whoever is ultimately making that decision, what is their take on all of that? And then how do they think their marketing and their all of that can build and be a partner with whatever's going to be taking place, with that conference. So I found that personally very fascinating. And then, obviously the last idea of, him kind of laying out San Diego State's resume and laying out, the idea that to me has always made sense of it's one giant city from Santa Barbara all the way down. I always crack up because they talk about San Diego being, a 1.4 million homes. Well, I live right next to San Diego, but it's the San Diego that's at the border. And then it's not continuous, right? There's the gap. And in between San Diego proper and the San Diego, the 92154, the part that's down by the border, there's 400,000 people in between. And like somehow they don't count as part of San Diego's, media evaluations, much less, Tijuana, etc. And so I found it at least refreshing that it's like, there's way more than 1.4 million people in San Diego County. If you're going to count that, you got to, and so just that thought that they want to stay there, they want to recruit there. And, I think that as you mentioned in your question, Southern California, I think had been responsible for upwards of 60% of former like viewership, et cetera. And to go from that. And then finally, as we've talked about before, not competing. The USC leaves, UCLA leaves, and they just say, okay, we're not gonna do anything in response. It would seem like the wrong message to send, and obviously Bob agrees and believes that San Diego State will be, one of those two teams that they add.
Yeah, I think you have to factor in, he said that he thought they would get $300 million for 10 teams, which would be $30 million a team. If they add San Diego State and SMU, are they going to get up to $360 million for 12 teams?
Right.
Probably not. But if they get up to $330 million and those two teams get a share for the first couple years, let's say a $15 million share, let's say a $20 million share, which means that the $30 million for those 10 is still, it's like a high 27, 28. Right, with the future potential. I think that's the key right there. The other thing he said was Utah, right? That he thought Utah was the most successful program that went from a G5 to a P5. And what have we been hearing all year about San Diego State's model? Utah, right? The football offensive coordinator is using the Utah offense model. The softball coach mentioned to us about the success that Utah has had going from the Mountain West to Pac-12 softball. Like, we hear it over and over again that they want to mimic that Utah model, whether it's on the field or in conference realignment. So that's something that San Diego State is harping on, that they could be the next Utah, and they'll happen to be in the same conference as Utah and competing against them.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see that part.
Absolutely. And as we've talked about a whole bunch, when we want to talk about conference realignment, we want there to be expertise and not just necessarily us going off the cuff. And obviously having Bob come on and do that, obviously great, very, very grateful for that. And I just thought it was a terrific episode.
Yeah, it was. It's nice to get somebody on here that we haven't talked to before and that we aren't familiar with. Obviously, media rights deals we have absolutely zero knowledge of. I will readily admit that, and so
not anymore.
A little bit smarter, maybe.
Absolutely,
that was a key, and hopefully, our listeners have a little bit more perspective on what's going on, and obviously, we all want a resolution sooner than later.
Absolutely.
All right, guys, that's gonna do it for us. Thank you for listening. As always, we appreciate all the subscriptions, the follows, the likes, shares. Keep them coming, and we will talk to you guys next time. You are listening to the SDSU podcast presented by the East Village Times with your hosts Andre Hagberdian and Paul Garrison.